I teach music and English.
Oh, okay. High school?
In secondary school, high school, yes.
In secondary school, okay.
Yes.
Those are two interesting subjects to teach in combination.
The combination, well, before I started my career in education, I was a full-time guitarist, a professional musician.
Oh, really?
I studied flamenco guitar at the Conservatory of Rotterdam, a city you visited. And I had a musical career for 10 years.
Yeah.
And when my...
A soloist?
A soloist in flamenco is also played in groups with a singer and a dancer.
Yeah. I've written an autobiography until the age of 22, and I've just sent it to an agent actually because it's an unusual autobiography. It's really it's about social mobility really, and through my own life, but also through the issues in education at the time as I experienced them as a child and then as a student. I had a wonderful teacher in primary school, and many years ago, while she was still alive, I wrote to her and sent her a copy of one of my books. It was a little book in big print. She was quite old, but I wrote to her to say it was a long time since I'd been in a class, but she'd been very inspirational for me to do this work. And I said, over 100,000 people have bought this book, and because you influenced me to come into this line of work, you've really influenced all of them. So thank you. And I began the letter saying, you probably don't remember me, but, and then she wrote back and she said, actually, I think I do remember you. She said, were you the boy who did that very special Spanish dance? So we used to, dancing was part of the curriculum when I was a child in primary school, expressive dancing. And she used to play Malaguena, which is, of course, gypsy flamenco.
Yeah.
And I loved it because I used to be able to just put my hands behind my back and just stamp my feet like that.
Just for my readers and viewers, Malaguena is this is a typical Malaguena theme, eh? Everybody knows.
Right, well, I can't stamp my feet at the moment, but go on, don't play it for me. That would be great.
Let me tune it. This is typical Malaguena. Maybe you recognize the tune.
Absolutely, yeah. And then it goes into a big strum.
Yeah.
And, yeah. Brilliant. Fantastic. That's made my day.
So, are you referring to Mary Hindle, which you talk about on your website?
Yeah, correct.
So I was wondering, but you're referring back to your time as a child in school. Well, you taught in primary school as well. Yeah. And I've seen many of your talks, and I've read your biography.
For a very brief time.
A very brief time, because I don't find a lot of information on the internet or in your speeches. You don't really refer to your time as a teacher. And I really wonder, how did you feel in front of a class?
So you'll get this in... You get a little bit in this, in the autobiography I've just written, and you'll get a lot more in the next autobiography.
I see.
How can I describe this? I think that when I went into teaching, I was aware of two things that weren't connected yet. One was through my own experience, particularly the contrast in experience between primary school and secondary school as a student. And because of what I'd learned in sociology about human relations and institutions, I was very concerned about what schools as institutions negatively were doing to many children. And I wanted to do something about that. I wanted to, all the things we know now, to engage children more in their own learning, with their own environment, their own communities, to give students more of a voice, to have them work on interdisciplinary projects, all the things we now talk about in terms of the whole child. And at that time, there was a philosophy supporting that in the UK. So that was really one reason I went into teaching, and the way I first approached it. And my ultimate goal, which I expressed when I responded to a survey from my secondary school when I was still a student, was that I intended to become a teacher educator to prepare a better generation of teachers than the ones who had taught me.
I see.
And at the same time, just before I went into teaching, I began to read a lot about the relationship between knowledge and social control, and its effect on class inequality. But by the time I went into teaching, I hadn't really yet connected these two things. So theoretically, I had an awareness of class inequality in the curriculum and knowledge and so on. But in practice, I was still in a libertarian kind of way, trying to create a world that protected children from the excesses of unwarranted adult authority. And so I went into primary school with an aim of probably teaching for 3 or 4 years, and then moving on to do a master's degree and possibly moving into teacher education. And this is a long answer to your question, but the first teaching practice I had was quite good, I was told. Actually, my feedback was, because I was quite an innovative teacher, and my feedback was I would either be a brilliant teacher or a terrible one. I would be nothing in between. And looking back, I think that was very good on everything, was a very good, very accurate piece of feedback. And the first teaching practice I had, I taught working class pupils, but they were really some of the best working class, the most respectable working class families in the city. It really wasn't hard, and so it didn't bring out the best of me, I think. The next school I went to in Sheffield was very close to where the Full Monty was filmed. It was one of the toughest schools in Sheffield. The children were clearly not as far ahead as the children I've been in the other school. They were more racially diverse. Nobody prepared us how to teach racially diverse and ethnoculturally diverse students at all. There was no content, there was no training, there was no... But it was then I began to connect, I think, the idea of a humanistic education to to more explicitly to education for social justice, and then I went to teach in a primary school in the middle of England, in next to a mining community, and I loved the teaching. I absolutely. It was a mixed age class. It was taught in what we now see as a very child-centered kind of way.
What do you mean by mixed age class?
A mixed age, yeah. So they were mixed age from 8 across 3 years, from 8 to 11.
It's kind of like the Montessori ideal.
Yeah. It was just a small school. It wasn't a philosophy. It was a necessity. And I truly loved the teaching. Some of the children wrote to me for years afterwards. Actually, we had a very good football team. But that's a whole other issue. And they asked me to stay on to be promoted. We had huge arguments about things that had nothing to do with classroom teaching. The biggest one which were incredibly stressful, and I could stand up to him, but the stress was enormous. One argument went on for 6 weeks because I refused to eat my school lunch with a fork. This was the dessert. I refused to eat my dessert with a fork. I'd been raised in a working class family. We only ever used a spoon. We didn't use a fork. He insisted I should use a fork because using a spoon was a bad example to the children. But I said, but these are minors' children. Wow. They don't use forks at home. Why should we teach them to use forks here? And then, of course, I was a very kind of headstrong young man. And then I started to make fun of him. And I said, well, should I eat my rice pudding with a fork? And eventually he threatened to report me to the school district, the local education authority, because this argument went on for 6 weeks. And this was typical of the utterly crazy arguments that had nothing to do with teaching that we had. And in the end, I headed him off, and I brought in the teachers' union to confront him, who sort of settled that. And I had the offer to go to another school, but I felt that going to another school was admitting that I was the problem, not he was the problem. And so I planned to do research. So I thought, well, I'll go and do my master's now, and then when I've done my master's, I'll come back and I'll teach some more. But then what happened was I did some part-time teaching while I was doing my master's. They talked me into staying on for a PhD. They liked my part-time teaching at the Teachers College, and so it developed a kind of logic of its own. But so it's a classic example that very often the major problems in a school are not the children, they're the adults.
How do you empower yourself as a teacher when you have management that has other plans with school which are maybe not as great as you think it can be? How do you make sure good ideas, teacher ideas from the bottom, can blossom, even though there's management that doesn't agree or toward those ideas? How do you do it?
There's two kinds of. There's a great book by Barbara Kellerman called Bad Leadership, and she says there are two kinds of bad leaders. There are, first of all, there are leaders who are manipulative and self-serving, and then there are leaders who are incompetent and inefficient. If the leaders are manipulative and self-serving, there's not much you can do, mainly, unless you're in a big school. If you're in a big school, then you can create some corners within the school where colleagues do things together and manipulative leaders usually don't have a lot of support. So the good news is they don't know everything that's going on in the school. And so you can create these mini worlds of your own where at least you can benefit some of the students within the school. An inefficient leader is a different issue. And I think then it is you have two tasks. One is to work around them, and the other is to lead them. So to begin to see yourself as the grown-up in the relationship. So what do? You, whether the leader is a principal or a teacher, you develop a relationship with them. You flatter them even though they don't deserve it sometimes. You thank them for when they do something well. If it's a teacher who's very different from you, who's got a formal teacher leadership position, before you tell them all about your own wonderful teaching, take an interest in their teaching and find things in it to talk about. And sometimes you may be surprised that their teaching is a lot better than you imagined it would be, that in their own way they're very dedicated towards the kids. And I've seen examples of this, that once you show an interest, genuine interest in what it is that they're doing, then they'll begin to take an interest in what it is that you're doing over time. But it will take time, and you have to be persistent, and you have to be prepared at first for people to be cynical or skeptical when you're going about it that way.
I see. Well, I interviewed Micheal Fullan on his book,
Yeah.
The New Meaning of Educational Change, and he told me, when I asked him the same question, he said you have to team up with your colleagues. But in the end, he says the team leader and the principal is an important factor. If you don't cooperate, it's not going to happen. Even though your team is amazing, without that leadership, it's not going to happen. In Holland, we have a yearly report from the government inspection, and every year there's the same conclusion, that the strong schools are strong because of strong leadership.
Yes.
And I think, how is it possible that many weak schools have weak leadership? How come we don't have a system that eradicates weak leadership? How does it exist? It blows my mind that we all, every year, conclude again that strong schools have strong leaders and weak schools, well, they don't say weak leadership, but I draw that conclusion.
Yeah.
Are there some safety measures to prevent those weak leaders from teaching year after year?
In the Netherlands, once you're a principal in a school, can you stay there forever?
Yeah, you can.
You can.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there are several answers that people try for this. One is evaluation. And evaluation is not a bad thing. We should all be held to standards and see that we can meet them over time. But in teaching mainly, evaluation is not very effective, as removing the bad people is mainly not the best strategy to getting more good people. So I'm not saying you shouldn't have evaluation, and I think more schools, district systems should be truly courageous when somebody is not very effective in their job, should find them another job to do, and should do that in a humanitarian way. So we studied, for instance, the London borough of Hackney, which was the worst performing school district in England. And 10 years later was above the national average, still with children from very poor families. And they did many things to transform the district. Some of it was very inspirational. When the new leader of the district came in, his opening talk to the principals, the head teachers, was, he said, at the moment, he said, "You're ashamed to work in Hackney, aren't you?" when people ask you where you work, you don't want to tell them it's in Hackney, because this is the worst school system in England. And you know people are thinking, you're only a principal here because you can't be a principal anywhere else. That's what you're thinking. And he said, when we've done our work, you'll be proud to work in Hackney. You'll boast about working in Hackney. People will envy you for working in Hackney. And they use many ways to turn that around. Some of the strategies were, most of the strategies were very positive, and they were a lot about identifying very early people who looked like they had a bit of leadership potential, and then really bringing them on and connecting them with other outstanding principals, and then having some principals work across 3 or 4 schools, coaching other principals, and then they would coach others over time. So a lot of the strategy was very collaborative, very positive, early identification, collaborative development. But they were also prepared to say, after a lot of support, they'd sit down with someone and say, this job is not for you. This job is too hard for you. Yeah. It's not a good fit. The children aren't learning. You're not enjoying it. It's not helping anybody. And so in a very dignified way, they would fire them. And then they would help them find another job of some kind, not necessarily but perhaps being a principal of a different kind of school or area with different kids who weren't so overwhelmingly challenging, or an advisor or a coach or a consultant. But so you need to put most of your energy into the first thing, but you absolutely have to be prepared to do the second thing as well. And you do that firmly, but with honour and dignity, just like you do everything else as a leader. The test of a leader is how you fire people.
The test of a leader is how you fire people, but the thing is, the principal is the top leader in the school.
Yeah.
So he's not
going. Then there are people above the principal. There are the owners. If it's a network of schools, there are people who run, as you have. There are people who run the networks of schools. So they are leaders who have the responsibility to do that with the principals too. The worst thing that happens is we move incompetence around. So in districts in Canada, for example, many, the norm is you move the principal every 5 years. And the theory is it's good for it's a great theory. The theory is it's good for the principal because they get different experiences, they grow their leadership. Their theory is it's good for the school, and that you can figure out where the school is at and get the right kind of leader next, and that it's good for the system. It kind of grows leadership capacity in the system. But the truth is it's dreadful because it prevents the system from removing bad leaders. And what they'll do is they'll get a school to a high level, and then they'll think the school can cope with a poor leader for 4 or 5 years. But the truth is it can't. And so moving people around is a great theory, but it excuses the system from dealing more effectively with incompetence.
So do you have an example of a country that really solves this problem in a good way, where we fire bad principals with dignity and they accept their fate?
So Singapore is not a democracy in the way we would understand it. So in Singapore, they select their teachers and principals very, very carefully. Everybody has career counselling every year. Teachers go through 3 tracks. Every teacher has a performance number in the system. and that number is reviewed every year in terms of what level of performance they're at of all the teachers in the system. If you're a very good teacher, you were asked as a matter of honour to go and work in a very challenging school. So some of the best teachers are assigned to go to some of those difficult schools, and because of the issue of national identity in Singapore, teachers they don't receive more money. They're just greatly honoured by being asked to do that. They principals are all trained by the same institution. It's not a kind of wild, crazy, open, free market.
Yeah.
That institution is very closely connected to the government. There's lots of movement of staff between the two, so the government and principal preparation and teacher education work closely together. And at first first thing is you're seen as having potential as a principal, and then they send you on a training course. They don't send you on a training course and then see if you have potential as a principal. It's actually the other way around in lots of ways. The other way around it is the Nordic countries. And in the Nordic countries, the principals are elected, usually, except for Sweden now. So a principal is the first among equals. They sometimes complain they don't have enough authority because they've been elected. And but what it means in a way is there is much more distributed responsibility and collaborative responsibility within the school. It's not all dependent on how brilliant or terrible one individual leader is.
You mentioned before one important thing. You said when you're an excellent teacher in Singapore, you're assigned as an honor to a weak performing school or a challenging school.
Yeah.
Last year I talked to John Hattie from Australia, and he told me they have 4 degrees of teachers in Australia: advanced teacher, teacher leader, 4 kinds. And he said if you choose to teach in a challenging school, you are paid more.
Yeah.
So is this in fact? It's the second time I hear about excellent teachers going to challenging schools. Is this the solution for weak schools to attract excellent teachers?
It's part of the solution, but it's not the main solution. I'd say, some teachers have other jobs sometimes. They might teach a class in a university. They might do some tutoring. They have other jobs. If you're teaching a weak school, you can't afford to have another job because that school needs everything that you have. And so you need to pay people more so that they won't have other jobs. I think that partly it's a status thing, but it's also that school needs all of their professional attention. But the money's not the main thing. In California, which has 43 million people, it's the 8th largest economy in the world. The union, which is very powerful, the California Teachers Association, surveyed its members and asked them what would be the top 2 things that would persuade you to move from teaching in a suburban school, an affluent school, to teaching in a very challenging school in a poor area. And pay was number 3. What do you think the other 2 were?
Well, some kind of dignity, respect from the environment, a low workload, I would say.
Mm-hmm.
Access to information, education for teachers, stuff like that.
Well, they said 2 things, and the first connects with what you said. Small class sizes. Small class sizes aren't just about having fewer children to control. With smaller class sizes, you have less bureaucracy, you have less paperwork, you have less papers to grade, less reports to write, fewer parents to meet. So the work is more challenging, but the scope of the work is not so great. It's not just about controlling the class. And it enables you to respond to diversity more effectively. So smaller class sizes was one. The other one was working for an outstanding principal. So the California Teachers Association actually supports every school having an outstanding principal because their teachers really want to work for very inspiring leaders. And it goes back to your opening question. These are the two big things again: working conditions that are manageable, and leadership conditions that are inspiring. So you're able to do the work you really want to do without lots of other things getting in the way.
One of my questions, let's go back to the book Professional Capital. I've got two questions. Okay, so first of all, what's your main message in the book? What's your theory? And secondly, how would it be different if you had to write the book again today?
Okay, well, I think the book has done phenomenally well. I think it's more successful than any book that Micheal Fullan and I have written individually. Even though we've written some strong books individually, I think it's even more successful. So first is the power of collaboration in bringing together two minds and two sets of ideas. The book has one idea, two words, and three components, and people can remember that. So I think it's, the idea is professional capital. It's two words. And it has three components which are in that equation on the front: human capital, social capital, and decisional capital. And the book, I think, came out at a time when many people in many countries were unhappy about the direction that their governments were moving teaching in, that they were moving it towards a business capital model. And in countries like Sweden and England and the United States, that was really beginning to use schools as a market for creating profits. And one of the ways you increase profits, or in the society, lower taxation, is to release more money for the private sector, is to lower teacher salaries. And you lower teacher salaries, the method was by evaluating individuals in relation to test scores. So this is the other side of your argument about how to deal with incompetence, that draconian systems can use evaluation to get rid of old expensive teachers in favour of cheap young, but not necessarily better teachers over time. So, first of all, the book is against something. It's against the deprofessionalisation of teaching. It's against using education and children as a source of income or profit for the wealthy in society. And against that, we use this term quite deliberately of professional capital, really to fight one kind of capital with another. And the metaphor of capital is very simple. If you want a return, you make an investment. And there are three ways to make that investment. One is to invest in individuals. That is to train them, prepare them properly, as the leading educational systems in the world do, through university-based programs closely connected to practice. Netherlands is an exception in not preparing its teachers through universities mainly at the moment, but most countries do. To give teachers good opportunities for effective professional development, to pay them enough. It's not fantastic pay that matters, it's good pay. And to support them with the idea that this is a lifelong career in education. You may leave teaching, be a principal, be a professor, but education is like you don't leave education and dig roads or operate on people's bodies. This is this is a lifelong commitment. So that's human capital, which is we need the right people in our schools. The second is decision-making capital, and that is over time all professionals develop better judgments, and you develop better judgments with practice and repetition, and also with stretching yourself with new experiences, coaching, mentoring, and new knowledge. So teaching, education is, for most people, not a job to come into quickly and then leave, but to persist with over time and challenge and stretch yourself and have the system do that for you. And third is probably the most important of the three, which is the social capital. So whatever the biggest changes you make in a system are not immediately with the new people you recruit. You mainly have to change with the people you already have. And how do you add value to the people you already have? And the evidence is, as John Hattie also indicates through things like collective efficacy, it is the way you get people to work together. And so teachers can and will be quite different kinds of teachers in their levels of effectiveness, depending on who their colleagues are and how supported they are, how well they're learning from them, what kind of feedback they get from them over time. And these three things are very simple. Human capital, bring in the right people. Decision-making capital, keep them over time, challenge and stretch them. Social capital, get them to work together effectively.
And together
that's
that makes
very different from the business capital model.
And together that makes professional capital.
It does. Yeah.
And how do I know when the balance is correct, when it's right? Between decisional.
Could you say that again? What do you mean by that?
How do I know, as a school leader or maybe as a teacher, that the balance in my school is right between social capital, decisional capital, and human capital? We need to find the right balance in schools.
Yeah. Well, notice it's not a balance. So mathematically, it's a question of function. So all three of them are important, and they'll work together in different ways at different times. Sometimes you'll want to, if you're in a brand new school, all your emphasis will be on recruitment initially. But even with the recruitment, you need to think about social capital too. So we've just written a book called Collaborative Professionalism, which looks at 5 outstanding examples of collaboration with different designs in different parts of the world. One of them is lesson study in Hong Kong. And the school we looked at, when they select new teachers, they don't ask the new teacher to teach a lesson. They say this is ridiculous because they don't know the kids, they don't know the school. It's a false test. It's just like a theatrical performance. Instead, they ask the students to go and observe lessons by some of the most experienced teachers in the school, and then give those teachers critical feedback on their lessons. So as a new teacher, you learn that this is the way the community is, that even the best teachers seek out critical feedback. And this is how you grow and develop as a community. So even when your emphasis seems like it's all on human capital, the social capital still has to be there in how you do it.
But because it's presented as a formula, that implies that there should be some kind of balance. But it's more a feeling. As a leader,
there's no balance. There's no addition or multiplication. It's a function. The commas are functions, which means they're connected and they're integrated. And you have to think about all three at once. One will be in the foreground sometimes, and the other will be in the background.
Is it more like
all of them are always there?
Is it more like awareness? Is that a correct word? Awareness that these three functions are in a school. In fact,
they're all there always. They're either there in a good way or they're there in a bad way.
So it was
they're always there.
It was written 6 years ago, and now today we have a different world. Certainly with the new president. So, what would you have changed? What would you change if you had to rewrite the book today?
Well, it would be shorter. It would be shorter.
Can you elaborate a bit more on that?
I think it would get to the big ideas more quickly than it does at the moment. We do have a long section about the stereotypes that people have of teaching, and we try to go through those and acknowledge those, really, to discuss what teaching is. So just pedagogically, treating writing as pedagogy, I think we get to the point much more quickly. I agree that even at the time we wrote it, teaching is changing. Well, teaching was already more variable in the ways we wrote about it. So we get letters, how does our work apply to developing countries, where you have 70, 80 students in the class. We are working in the Pacific Northwest with isolated rural schools. You don't have many of those in the Netherlands, but many countries do. And a lot of poverty is rural poverty. And so if you live in a very poor rural community, you have a double disadvantage from your own poverty and isolation, but also from the fact that your teachers do not have access to social capital from teachers like them. You're the only teacher of your grade or your subject, and the next school may be several hours away from you. So we've been working with a network of schools to build collaboration amongst them, where they design lessons together, units of work. They communicate with each other. Their students communicate with each other, and they do that in part through a digital platform. So they use a platform called Schoology that does most of the things that most digital platforms do. They also use Google Hangout, Skype, other things, so that both they and their students can communicate. But it seems that they need to meet physically about twice a year in order to sustain those virtual interactions over time. So through this rural community, we're learning what social capital, what are the challenges and the necessity of social capital in very tiny schools or very isolated communities. And also, what are some of the opportunities and obstacles with building social capital virtually, as well as building it face to face. And so I think when we write this again, I have a letter from my publisher today, actually, saying when's the second edition coming out. So they're very keen on a second edition. And Micheal Fullan is 77 years old now, so we should probably do this sooner rather than later. And that would be, I think, how to deal with professional capital in these other kinds of circumstances is something we need to address.
Another thing that really fascinates me today, I just mentioned the new president of the United States, Donald Trump, is that we tend to read and hear a lot about his policies, about his foreign policies, about Israel, about the UN, about climate change, but we never hear about the domestic market of education. So I'm always, when I talk to scientists, I talk to Richard Ryan. He wrote Self-Determination Theory together with Edward Deasy. He told me that the race to the top policy was his quote. The race to the top policy, he said, it was no child left behind on steroids. He said it was terrible, this policy. So we don't have insights in what happens in education in the United States. So my question to you is, how would you describe the current educational system under Trump? What has changed, or has anything changed at all?
Well, let me talk about Trump, but what Trump is an example of. And it comes back to bad leadership. And in education, public education worldwide, there are two kinds of bad leadership at the moment. One is leadership that has the wrong visions. So leadership that is like No Child Left Behind. It's about standardization, unrealistic targets, a narrow curriculum, social studies that is boring, fact-related content, not engagement with ideas and issues. So one is bad system leadership, which has a vision, but it is a vision. It is a vision that will create more rather than less inequity between our students, and a narrow rather than a broad experience of learning. The other one is no vision, and I think the United States and to some extent England are examples of systems that have no vision of the content or the substance of education. Their vision is business capital. It is a market where the purpose of schools is mainly to generate profit and to respond to individual choice of the more privileged parts of the electorate. So every school becomes its own school. Every place becomes its own place. They can mainly do what they want, providing they don't do anything truly terrible. The schools in wealthy communities will do well. They'll attract better students. They'll attract better teachers. They'll have better funding. They'll be some of the best schools in the world. And the many schools in poor communities will have poor teachers, poor leaders. Sorry, I need to plug in. My computer is running out of its battery. So the second vision is really no vision other than where individual choice means some individual schools in privileged communities will do well, and many schools in poor communities will attract less funding, weaker leadership, less stability in the teaching force. People will move in and out, endless crises and interventions, but no vision of what learning is for, what the curriculum is for, how what it is for now for children, and what it is for their lives in the future.
Has there ever been a vision in the United States under Obama or the Bush administration? I mean,
there was a very clear vision. Many people didn't like it, and the vision was equity in terms of narrowing achievement gaps, and it was much more clearly to have charter schools as alternatives to very ineffective conventional public schools. So there was a vision. It didn't work out. It wasn't effective. Some people for good reasons, some people for bad reasons, supported that vision. But now there's really no vision at all. It's the Wild West, actually, of educational change now. And but the good news is much more authority now goes to the state. And so some states are doing some quite progressive things within that chaos. And so California has given school districts more autonomy over budgets and decision making. It has less testing rather than more testing. So the bad news is when nobody's in control, nobody's in control. The good news is that nobody's in control.
Well,
and some states are seeing that as an opportunity.
This brings me to my next question. I've got a couple of more questions about skills, 21st century skills, about technology, and about the future of education. That's more or less what I want to talk about. Last year I talked to Robert Mazzano, and he told me the problem is in the United States we do not have a national curriculum, and we were talking about 21st century skills and how every school tends to focus on these skills. And I asked him, how can we assess these skills in an honest way when we don't have a national curriculum? How can you assess anything in an honest way when there's 50 different states assessing in 50 different ways?
Yeah.
So my question is, I wrote you about the 21st century skills. How important are those skills in the United States, and how do you assess those skills at all?
Okay, I'm going to read you something, and I want you to tell me who wrote this. One obvious purpose is to fit children for the society into which they will grow up. To do this successfully, it's necessary to predict what that society will be like. It will certainly be one marked by rapid and far-reaching economic and social change. More people will be called upon to change their occupation. About such a society, we can be both hopeful and fearful. We can hope it will care for all its members and that it will create an environment which is stimulating, honest, and tolerant. We can fear that it will be much engrossed with the pursuit of material wealth, too hostile to minorities, too dominated by mass opinion, too uncertain of its values. For such a society, children and the adults they will become will need above all to be adaptable and capable of adjusting to their changing environment. They will need, as always, to be able to live with their fellows, respecting their differences, understanding and sympathizing with their feelings. Have a guess where that comes from.
Well, when I look at language, it might just be a couple of decades old.
Yeah.
So let's say a visionary like John Dewey or Hannah Arendt.
This is 1967.
I see.
And it's from the UK, the landmark report on primary education in the UK called the Plowden Report. That was very influential on what we would now call whole child education. So this is a path that has been there for a long time. But sometimes, for decades, we forget to tread the path, and so the path disappears. And so when we begin to beat a new path, we imagine it's a completely new path, but it's not. What this means is, for a long time, these issues have been important for at least half a century, just as democracy is. If we do not keep beating the path will disappear. That's the key thing. And it's much easier to walk an old path, but keep walking it, than it is to beat a completely new path. So these issues are perpetual. People do need to be prepared for change, to put their self-interests to one side, to be tolerant of and accepting and engaging with views of the community around them. The digital world magnifies that in lots of ways. So identity is not just a question of my language, my culture, my community, my age, my gender. It's also a question of how I look when I'm online. So we know that young people now are safer out in the real world. They're getting pregnant less early. There's less substance abuse. There's less physical violence amongst young people. But they're more anxious and depressed because particularly girls are sitting with their iPhones late into the night, not sleeping, wondering what everybody thinks of them and their so-called perfect life. And this is the world that we now have to engage with. Some people's answer to that world, like France or the proposal in Ontario, is to ban cell phones from classrooms. So people approach it by thinking, as we often do in educational change, we think, what are the bad things and how do we get rid of them? But it's easier to get rid of bad things than it is to develop a good thing. Suppose, for example, just hypothetically, France has a very traditional curriculum and hierarchical forms of teaching and is not innovative. Then removing cell phones from the classroom will not suddenly make those classrooms innovative or the teachers more engaged or more responsive to all the immigrant and refugee communities who are coming into their schools. You need a positive strategy in order to do that. And therefore, for me, when you ask what questions does the digital world pose for teaching and learning, I have two answers. One is the teacher will need less authority, and second, the teacher will need more authority. The teacher will need less authority because you won't be able to, you can't bluff anymore in a classroom if children can immediately look up the truth of what you're saying, just as my students do. I can't bluff. I can no longer be in the middle of a lecture where I reach that moment and I'm not completely sure of a fact I'm coming up with, but I go with it anyway because I know I'm in the middle of a lecture, because within 2 minutes a hand will come up and somebody will question it with a website that they have gone to. So this means two things. It means that a lot of the time we are now supporting students to engage in their own inquiry, to distinguish what is true from what is fake, to know how to sift information, to connect them with experts, but not too much so that it overwhelms the experts, to link them with students in other schools, to connect their own world to the world beyond them. In some ways, teachers need less traditional authority. But in terms of the stuff they do know, they need more authority because you can't bluff. And every child wants a teacher who knows something and knows it really well. A great story, perhaps, which is a long human tradition. Every child wants their own Ken Robinson in the class sometimes. They don't just want Ken Robinson on video. They want their Ken, but when they have their Ken Robinson really has to know. So what the teacher will claim to know something about may be smaller, but then they'll really need to know it and really be able to communicate it in an inspiring and engaging way. So the world of the internet means less authority and more authority for the teacher. And the same is true for the child, which is knowing how to find information, but also having some areas of learning where they become so expert, they know more than their teacher does, because they've explored it in such great depth. We need both content and process. We need mastery of knowledge, disciplines, foundations still, and also the skills and the dispositions to analyze, synthesize, integrate, and apply and circulate knowledge too.
Thank you. 3 more questions. One is the future. What are the biggest challenges, global challenges, we are facing now? Noam Chomsky, for example, Professor Noam Chomsky, says that we are at the brink of, we have to choose whether we will save this planet from disaster, nuclear disaster, climate change. So what are the biggest challenges, and how can education add to the discussion, contribute to a solution? That's question 1. The second question is, what's your tip for teachers? Because I'm going to spread this message to my followers and talk about these. So do you have one practical example, a tip for teachers? What can we do in classrooms from tomorrow? And the last question is, what does your future look like?
Okay. So the first one was, you asked me for three things,
yes.
Did you? Global.
The global challenges and how education can solve problems.
I think the first is I'd agree with Noam Chomsky. If we do not have a planet and we do not have existence, we do not have anything. And so creating awareness and engagement of all the issues, the science surrounding climate change. But it's more than the science, it's more than the knowledge. It's taking care, it's engagement. It's being prepared to make a difference and not in some ways just understand the need for a difference. So I think everything to do with sustainability is really important for all people to learn. Sustainability of the planet, the environment. But part of sustainability, which the field of educational change has not yet grasped, is we need to treat our people sustainably, as well as treating nature sustainably. They're both exactly the same. And indigenous communities understand completely the connection between people and nature, not that we think about nature and then we think about organizations, but the two run together. So we mustn't burn people out. We mustn't treat them as if they are inexhaustible sources of energy. We must manage change at a pace that people can cope with, that does not run them into the ground. We must think about our legacy and our successors. So it can't be all about me as a leader, but I must think about who comes behind and help people prepare for that. I must prepare for my own death so that I can help people with the lives that have to follow. So I think even bigger than climate change is everywhere the issue of sustainability. That's number one. Number two is men. I think the world has a big problem with men at the moment. All the problems of violence in the world, all the fundamentalisms, there are many fundamentalisms, not just Islamic, but many fundamentalisms, mostly religious, but not completely. When you see the images on TV of who's committing the violence, it's not women, it's men, and we rightfully have a global movement to make education more accessible to girls, and I completely support that, and it's very needed. But there's a second question people are afraid to raise, and that is, how are we educating our men in different cultures? What kind of education are boys receiving? Not just how much, but what kind? What kinds of men are they going to become in relation to women, in relation to children, and in relation to society? And nobody dare name this, but we have to. The reason women and girls have a problem with access to quality education is not because of problems that women have created. It's because of problems that mainly men have created. So we need to be better men. We need to educate better men, and we need to name that as one of our most compelling issues. And I think thirdly is children. I think we are so, mainly for the right reasons, focused on what children should become. We forget what they need to be now. Young people spend mainly now in most developed societies 1/4 of their lives before they move into the workforce. And we cannot treat those lives only as a kind of waiting room for something else, that we're preparing them. Those lives have value in their own right. Whether children are learning, stimulating, joyful, challenged, empathetic, responsible, loved, sleeping. All these things are the needs of children now, and if we pay better attention to the needs of children now, as well as what they need to become in the future, we'll have better adults and citizens in the future.
Those are three things: sustainability, men, plural, and children. Yeah. And it just reminded me of a book I read. It's a book written by Mark Prensky. He wrote Education to Better Their World, and he's talking about real-world projects where children learn about sustainability by solving real-world problems. Yeah. Is that maybe a way? In one of my questions is, how does it relate to schools? What can we do as schools? Is that maybe a possibility?
Yeah, it's the way we think about. One way we think about this is well-being, and we've been doing a lot of work recently, particularly in Ontario, on how our schools approach issues of child well-being and the relationship of well-being to learning, including in mathematics, literacy, and so on. And some people, particularly opponents of the well-being agenda, argue that, well, schools need to be about more than making children happy. And they do, because well-being is not the same as happiness. Now, we don't want to make children miserable, but the main thing is do people actually, and also children, have lives of meaning and purpose? And that includes their learning. And so if children's learning has meaning and purpose, and sometimes it's joyful, sometimes it's thrilling, sometimes it's difficult and frustrating, and you have to overcome that, then you are also likely ultimately to feel happy and fulfilled and successful, all those things. And that can take many forms. It can be real-world problems in business, in politics. In schools, we've been looking at doing things like compare the water quality in indigenous communities with nearby suburban communities, and then decide what that means. They'll study the Syrian refugee crisis, and one of the schools raised money and adopted for a year a Syrian refugee family. So there are many, many ways that we can do this, but I agree with the basic idea. Not everything we do in school can be, deep and heavy all the time. We also need to run and play, but learning that has meaning and purpose is learning worth having.
My penultimate question: as a teacher, where do I start tomorrow? When it comes to your message, maybe professional capital, but you wrote many more books, over 30 books. So what's your tip for teachers? Where do we start?
So the short answer is to start somewhere. And so start somewhere. Don't wait for other people. The principle of collective responsibility of what we should do is really important, but so too is personal responsibility, which is what I should do. And so as a matter of principle, don't always say, oh, the principal doesn't do this, or they don't do that, or we've got these teachers in the school who, just want to keep on teaching the same old way. The biggest changes that you can make are changes in yourself. And so even if you're in a very difficult school, which is very test-driven, for example, in many countries now, including a number in Europe, then think, well, surely like one afternoon a week, I can do something different. Like Friday afternoon, I can do an interdisciplinary project or an inquiry project with the kids. It's one afternoon. Another 2 hours of test prep, it isn't going to elevate our scores that much more. So one thing is actually teach something different. Teach something that you enjoy, as well as your kids enjoy. When I'm really overwhelmed and I feel I have 270 emails, and I have some big responsibilities. I run an international summit of 9 different countries dedicated to equity, inclusion, human rights, and democracy. We've just met for 3 days, the last 3 days, the ministers and so on. I'm president of the International Congress for School Effectiveness and Improvement. We've gone through a huge transformation in the last 2 years. And I find one of the best things for me is when I've been spending hours responding to emails and so on, is part of me wants to stop and rest and stop doing bad things. But I find the best renewing strategy for me is to do a good thing. So I'll sit down and write, or I'll prepare an idea for a class, or I'll create a new idea. So in a world where you're experiencing lots of bad things, begin by creating something good for yourself and for your students, and it will elevate you. And then try and do that with somebody else if you can. So get to know somebody in your school you don't really know very well. Sit next to somebody different in the staff lounge. Take an interest in them before they take an interest in you. Build a relationship. I know people who say they've transformed their school by doing this, by beginning with this as a first. You can't fake it. You can't pretend you're interested when you really have to be curious about other adults are just big children. And just as a teacher, you should be curious about all your children's lives. As an adult, you should be curious about the lives of all the adults in the school as well. So it's like 2 very simple things. Start something, just a small thing that you're interested in, and that is positive and that benefits the kids. And secondly, build a relationship with somebody you don't know, and over time let that grow into your teaching.
Excellent. Well, last question is about you, Mr. Hargreaves.
Yes.
67, you're 67. In Holland, that's the age when people retire. I don't have the feeling that you are going to retire anywhere soon, at least not stop working on what you like most.
Yeah.
So what are your plans for the future? Are you going to retire at all? Are you going to spend more time with your family or hobbies?
Well, so I am formally retired. So I retired from Boston College.
Okay.
In last December.
Okay, because I checked your website and checked your schedule. It's pretty tight.
Yeah. Well, they held 5 retirement parties for me because I think they really wanted to make sure I knew I was retiring. Okay. So I'm still connected with Boston College. I have 3 other visiting professorships. We've moved to Ottawa in Canada. That is where 3 of our 4 grandchildren are, and we want to be close to them and to support my daughter's family, and to be of use to them before we want them to be of use to us. That is definitely a significant part of my life now. But the work is very busy still. Writing, speaking, advising projects. As I do want to do more hiking, even though I have a broken ankle now. That's a big part of my life too. But I plan to be busy as long as people have use for what it is that I think I can offer. When people feel there is no longer use for it, they should pull out the big hook and take me off. What specifically that that looks like is specifically, I am very passionate about this group of 9 countries and their leaders who, at their own expense, we have no money, we have no grant, we have no foundation. Every year they come to a summit where they commit to equity, democracy, human rights and inclusion, and broadly defined excellence. And they sit in peer learning groups together, exploring problems of practice and opportunities of practice together in an environment of complete openness, trust and learning. And they come every year, and we have no money, and they pay for themselves. And every year it feels like a miracle. It's one of the most moving things I've ever experienced. And we have thought leaders like Ken Robinson and Pasi Selber, who charge nothing for their time. And they come, and every year we have different thought leaders, and none of them charge any. Everybody just gives their time for this. And now we're beginning to talk about each system will pay a little bit more. And now we'll begin, as well as talk and share, we'll start to do things and create things that have an impact amongst the group, but also have an impact on the world. So in a way, we're trying to build a social movement for change around those values that has no money, no corporate funding, just decent people who believe and want to do something best. So this is, as long as they want it, I will give my time to help support them. That's a big thing. And I think if I'm to do another research project on any scale now, probably the one I'll do is in response to the question you asked, which is to do a big study. What is the nature of teaching in the 21st century? Not in the 20th century, but in the 21st century. And how can we understand that? And where does it need to go next? I think that in terms of research and inquiry, that is the next thing that I'd like to do.
Great answer. Well, I always ask my interviewees, who should I interview next? If you had to interview someone or to give me an advice, who really inspires you and is more or less accessible? President Obama might be a bit difficult.
Vicky Colbert. Do you know her?
No.
Vicky Colbert is the inaugural Yeadam Prize winner, $4 million for last year for the work that's had the greatest impact on the world of education. She is the director of a network of 25,000 schools called Escuela Nueva that began in Colombia, but now extends throughout Latin America and all across places like Vietnam and so on. She's in our, I have to show you this, she's in our book called Collaborative Professionalism. She's one of the 5 cases. She began in the mid-1970s, the daughter of a teacher in Colombia who yearned for peace and democracy in her society. And she felt the best way to create this was through schools, through education. And so she began, and now she has 25,000 schools, wow, whose main mission is peace and democracy, critical pedagogy, often with poorly trained teachers who grow by circulating the ideas amongst each other rather than implementing ideas from above. And according to the World Bank, these schools outperform, even though they're in isolated communities in the forests, they outperform the other public schools. So she's in about 70 years old now. She's utterly inspirational. And if you want to interview her, I can help you set that up.
Great. Thanks for this tip. Well, let me finish by thanking you. Thank you, Mr. Hargreaves, for your time. And thanks for making education better. I'm going to spread your message and share it with my network, because I too think education can be better every day of the week. So let's keep up the good work. And you're a great inspiration. And I've just been in education for 10 years, but it's people like you, like Micheal Fullan, like Marzano, like Hetty, who inspire me to pick this up and not to sit in a corner and complain about all the things that are wrong in education. But it's you have to agree with me. It's one of the most beautiful jobs you can have.
It's great you're doing this as a teacher. If you would reward me by closing with 3 minutes of flamenco guitar, I'll be a very happy guy.
Well, that's the least I can do. Well, let me tune up.
Okay. You know what I loved about listening to that was I loved what you played and how you played, but I love seeing how much you loved playing it.
Yeah. Well, that's my very core, music.
Yeah, beautiful, absolutely beautiful. So thanks for this. It's great as a teacher you're doing this. I think that is really huge. And I look forward to hearing from you. And,
you will. Well, thanks for your time. Enjoy the rest of the day. Bye-bye.
Yeah, bye-bye. Cheers, Simon.